True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Diane Whitmore grew up in the Midwest. Now, she was a smart girl, and as she matured, she was looking forward to an exciting life as an independent, sophisticated woman. But when it came to men, Diane had a bad picker. Diane married Joe Pikul after meeting him at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Now, he was exciting to her. Wealthy, outgoing, but emotionally unstable with a terrible temper. By the time the couple had children, they were fighting regularly. Joe's behavior had progressed from emotionally to physically abusive. Join us at the quiet end for One Last Family Weekend. Diane's friends feared for her safety, so they were all relieved when she finally decided that she would leave Joe. But at the same time, they worried about Diane taking unnecessary risks. Her brave exterior could no longer cover up how frightened she had become of her husband. Then, Joe asked Diane to meet him at their Amagansett vacation home for one last family weekend. She knew this was a bad idea, but she felt obligated to go for the sake of her children. This was a decision she wouldn't live long enough to regret. Now, this is just an outrageous story because this is someone who murders his wife and then gets custody of his children. So I just had to talk about this one. It just really blew me away.
Well, speaking of blowing you away, you might like this beer that we're going to do today.
Okay.
This is called Five Beans. It's from 6 Point Brewery, which is in Brooklyn. And this is a Baltic Porter, 10% alcohol by volume. It's a big boy. So it's a dark brown color, some reddish highlights in it, moderate tan head, kind of sticky. There's some sticky lace present. Nice aroma, coffee and spice. The taste improved on the aroma. A lot of coffee, some chocolate, a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of vanilla.
Now, I think that's kind of unusual because usually it smells better than it tastes, but here we've got the opposite.
Yeah, I thought the aroma was good. Just
Sure.
to me, it was a little bit muted, and it tasted better than the smell would indicate.
I think I've had it before, but it's been a while.
Oh, yeah, it's been a while.
So let's open it up. Couple cans, right?
Yes, a couple cans.
All right.
Distinctive skinny cans. They look cool.
I like them, sure. All right, down to the quiet end. I'm kind of excited to talk about this one because there's just so much to it. And like I said, I couldn't believe a lot of it.
Yeah, well, I want to know one thing.
Yeah?
Why did she agree to meet him?
At the vacation property?
Yeah.
Well, he had the kids, so that's one thing. Plus, she was worried about money because he had all the money and she wanted to be there when property was distributed. But I think it was mostly for the kids, yeah.
But there was so much going on in this case that,
Oh, yeah.
knowing what I know, I wouldn't meet him for $1 million
Oh, gosh,
by
no.
myself.
Right. And that's something we're going to learn about Diane is she did take a lot of risks. She had issues with men, and especially with this man, so some of her choices weren't great. But of course, she did not deserve what she got at all.
No.
So why don't you get us started? There's a lot to talk about here.
Sure. Diane was born to an older couple, and she was their only child. Her parents were Donald and Jane Whitmore, and they came from families who had lived in Indiana for generations. Now, South Bend, Indiana, was the headquarters for Studebaker. For you youngsters, that's a car. And this was in the 40s and 50s. And this is where Donald Whitmore worked as a plant engineer and where Diane spent her early years. Now, this was a Midwestern world of white Protestants where nearly everyone looked and lived lives like one another. Her parents never raised their voices or displayed much emotion. Diane wanted to be a writer, and in stories she wrote during the last 2 years of her life, She remembered her childhood with affection, even though she identified it as a legacy against which she would spend her life rebelling. So a lot of Diane's behavior and risky choices were likely made because of her need to leave behind her Indiana roots and become what she saw as a more worldly person.
Yeah, and as an only and very wanted child, Diane was treated like a princess. And she was a confident child because she grew up being very comfortable with adults. Childhood pictures of Diane show a smiling girl with blonde curls, dressed in clothing homemade by her mother. This small family went to Sunday services at a Presbyterian church together every week, so it was all very wholesome. Then the family moved to Detroit when Diane was 12. That's when Donald took a job at Anchor Steel and Conveyor Company. 2 years after that, they moved to New Jersey for a better-paying job at Mack Truck in North Plainfield. Diane had never fit in at her school in Detroit, but North Plainfield High was immediately comfortable for her. It didn't have the cliques that she had dealt with in Detroit, and she became friends with a pretty and popular girl named Eleanor. Now, while in high school, Diane worked weekends as a waitress at a restaurant, one of those that was known for its homemade pies.
Sort of like the Village Inn here, huh?
Yeah, but they changed the name of that one.
I know.
Butter something. I don't know. But when Diane wasn't working, she and Eleanor spent their weekends cheering. They cheered for North Plainfield's high school football and basketball teams. She made the honor roll every semester. She was president of the Spanish Club and the treasurer of the Dramatics Society. She also won first prize in the American Legion oratorical contest, and at graduation, she was the class valedictorian. So, a smart girl.
It seems to be.
Yeah.
And she seemed to be on her way to a great life. This is in 1960. And as an upper-middle-class girl, it was expected that she would go to a good college, then marry a young man in one of the professions, and have a family. But unlike her friends, Diane didn't want to get married or have kids right away. She wanted to have adventures and be a writer. She wanted to live in New York.
Absolutely. Big dream of hers.
Now, before high school graduation, Diane had started dating a North Plainfield High graduate who was at American University in Washington. The boy's name was Teddy, and he came from Greek heritage and looked like the opposite of all the all-American boys Diane was used to. Teddy didn't treat Diane very well. He often stood her up, but Diane was crazy about him. Her romance with an aloof college man, along with the tensions of a long-distance relationship, certainly gave Diane the drama she craved. Diane found Teddy especially compelling because he'd suffered, as she said. He had a chronic kidney disease that he had to be medicated for, and it would sometimes land him in the hospital. And not to the extent of needing dialysis or anything, right?
I don't know. He did eventually die from it, but not until much later. But the point here is Diane loved drama. That's the point we're trying to get across here.
I'm getting that.
Because we're not going to talk much about Teddy from here on out. We're pretty much done with Teddy. Now, Diane attended Mary Washington College for her freshman year, and this was a very conservative college. And although she did do well there, it just wasn't for her. So she transferred to Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts. At a Yale mixer in the winter of her junior year, a handsome student in his early 20s, Doug Johnston, asked Diane to dance. Now, Doug was considered a real catch. Tall, dark, and handsome, from a well-off family, Doug had grown up in the exclusive Oyster Bay community in Long Island. He was in Yale Medical School, and he was a straight arrow. There wasn't a rebellious bone in Doug's body. He liked women who were pretty and well-dressed, and he expected the girl he married to become a housewife. So Diane started dating Doug, going to Yale almost every weekend, getting dressed up for dinners with him at nice restaurants, or sometimes just making simple meals in his off-campus apartment, and he fell deeply in love with her. She often talked about how much she loved New York, the hippie movement, and the different people there. But she presented herself at first as a girl who didn't want to do more than settle down with a husband and raise a family. So in 1964, Diane and Doug were engaged. But Diane was restless. She told her friends that she was breaking up with Doug because she just didn't love him. When Diane told Doug over the phone that she was going to give him back the diamond ring, he was devastated. He even considered walking out on his internship program to be near her and try and win her back again. Although he did stay in medical school, his attempts to win Diane back would go on for years.
I just say that breaking up with your fiancé over the phone is kind of a shitty move.
Yes.
Thank you.
I agree.
So the summer after graduation, Diane worked at a bank in San Francisco. Then she finally went to New York. She lived in an Upper East Side apartment with 3 other girls that she had met through a roommate service. And because her grades were good and her Mount Holyoke professors recommended her highly, she had no trouble getting what was a dream job, and that was secretary to the Modern Living editor at Life magazine. That does sound pretty good for your first job out of college.
Now, this would be her dream job, really, but then things kind of changed for her there. Her boss was constantly encouraging Diane to get more serious about her work, but Diane really seemed ambivalent. She wasn't typical of the entry-level girls at Time Life because she seemed to be living for the nightlife. She didn't want to settle in New Jersey and have 3 kids, but she didn't want to work hard to become an editor in New York either. Living with neither of these motivations, Diane became somewhat aimless.
Yeah, that's kind of a quandary, isn't it?
It was really tough for her parents to understand, I'll tell you that.
Well, I can see that.
Yes. But, it was the hippie movement, and she was just really into that. So after being in New York for about a year, Diane moved to the Village. She went out to new discotheques in the East Village, and she seemed content with her job at the publishing company, her tenement apartment, and just going out drinking every night. Doug Johnston, who was doing his residency in Manhattan at that time, was pretty upset. His former fiancée, the girl who he felt would fit right in on Oyster Bay, was now living in this rundown apartment, dressing like a hippie, and hanging out with dope smokers. Yikes. So Diane spent the next few years dating some dangerous men, and she developed a serious drinking problem.
So Doug, the doctor, continued to have some contact with her.
Yeah, he was really in love with her. It would take him years to finally give up on her. I think she eventually did try and hook up with him, but by then he was just done. Because, not only was she living this alternative lifestyle, she might not have meant to be cruel, but she was kind of cruel to him. His heart was broken.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Diane did marry, but it wasn't Doug.
No, it wasn't.
She married a guy named Ralph Schnackenberg in 1975. And this was a turbulent relationship. That's probably a kind word for it. Just 1 week into the marriage, Ralph found Diane opening his mail. And he said to her, "If you do that again, I'll push you out the window." This terrified Diane. She called her father. And Dad sent Diane money, and she had the marriage annulled. That didn't last long.
It didn't last long at all. And, Ralph would say, I was just saying that, kind of kidding. But Diane took it seriously, and I don't know, maybe that was partly an excuse to get out of the marriage, or if she really was terrified of him. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
But she got out.
Yeah. Ralph would claim that Diane drank down a glass of vodka every morning before work, just to get going. This was a full glass, by the way. It wasn't like she was just taking a little nip.
No, like a 12 or 16-ounce glass of vodka, straight.
Yeah.
But she didn't drink at work, and she was able to, pull it off for a while without anyone noticing, I guess. But Diane was aware that she had a drinking problem. Still, it would take her 3 more years when she eventually did join Alcoholics Anonymous. So it was one evening in January of 1978 when Diane walked into a storefront building with heavily draped windows for her first meeting. Inside, casually dressed people sat on folding chairs drinking coffee. Diane was dressed in the style made popular by Diane Keaton in Annie Hall. So she seemed a little more sophisticated. And she stood and said, "My name is Diane, and I'm an alcoholic." So that was a big step. And most of the people there were very encouraging. They smiled at her. But at the same time, there was an older, well-dressed man standing in the back of the room watching Diane, and this was Joseph Pikul. Joe Pikul was a high-strung 43-year-old man with an attitude that was a composite of all the inappropriate men Diane had ever been attracted to.
So this composite is all the inappropriate traits that these other guys exhibited?
All rolled into one, so how could she resist it?
Well, there's exactly my question.
Yeah.
Is she going to fix him?
I don't know if that's it or what. I mean, she's just one of these women that had a bad picker. She was attracted to the wrong things. And, I think that's more common than you might think. It happens a lot.
Yeah.
Now, his background was very different from hers, and he had suffered, which Diane liked. As a child, he'd been beaten by his father. But much like Doug Johnston, he did hold the promise of entry into higher society. But unlike Doug, Joe's access to that world was not by birth, but by the money he had earned himself. So she kind of appreciated that as well.
Yeah, and he did. He was basically a self-made man.
Yes. Yes, he was quite successful. Although at this point, he'd been through a lot.
Yes.
He had been sober for about 2 years when he met Diane. And we can't know exactly how he was maintaining his sobriety, but the other AA members who knew him would say that Joe had a lot of demons. Joe was a very nervous man who always seemed right on edge. And by his own admission, he was a violent man. Joe had spoken about how he had lost everything he had because of alcohol, his marriage, and the success he had worked for his entire life. He was starting all over from nothing when he went to AA. And one of the most revealing things Joe ever said at a meeting was not said aloud to the group. It was a disturbing whispered statement that one member overheard him say to the man sitting next to him. Joe said, "Sometimes I think I'm looking at life through a killer's eyes."
That'll get your attention.
Yes.
Joe was born 9 years before Diane in a working-class town of Ware, Massachusetts. He was the only son of poor Catholic Polish immigrants, and the family was very religious. His father worked in a textile mill as a weaver, and his mother worked in the shoe factory to help pay bills. Joe and his sister Janice would play with buttons from their mother's sewing box because the family couldn't afford any toys. Joe Sr. was a frequent drunk, and he would take his anger and frustration out on his son Joe. From his harsh childhood, Joe somehow gathered enough self-esteem and determination to reinvent himself. He insisted on going to college despite his parents' inability to pay for it. He worked for a year after high school in order to earn money to pay for college. And he worked in construction during the day, came home for dinner, changed his clothes, and then he went to his second job, working a night shift at a textile mill.
So this is all pretty admirable.
Very.
Yeah.
And with the money saved from those jobs, along with an ROTC scholarship that he got, Joe took classes at Boston's Northeastern University.
Good school.
Uh-huh.
So on a blind date in 1955, when Joe was a sophomore, he met Sandra Jarvinen, a freshman. Both sides of Sandra's family were from Finland. Her father owned a trucking and construction company, and the family spent 2 to 3 months of each year in Palm Beach. So there was some money there. Sandra had had her own car since she was 16, and she also had a horse. Her higher social class, Sandra believed, was a big part of Joe's attraction to her, which would be understandable. But Sandra was also impressed by Joe, who worked really hard and was very charming. But of course it wasn't all good. There were the red flags. When Sandra told Joe that she and some girlfriends were taking a trip to Bermuda, for instance, Joe was very upset. Now Sandra took the trip anyway, but when she got back, Joe made a really big scene over it. Turns out he was incredibly possessive.
That's never good.
No. Now he did graduate from Northeastern and was accepted with financial aid to MBA programs at both Columbia and Wharton. He turned both of these down, though, in order to go to Harvard Business School, even though there was no financial aid offered to him there. So after graduation, he took 6 months off to do active duty at the Army School of Finance in Indianapolis, then at Fort Devens in Massachusetts. In 1959, Joe and Sandra were married at a Catholic church in Boston. A small reception was held at Joe and Sandra's new apartment on Beacon Street, right around the corner from the Ritz-Carlton. Sandra's parents disapproved of Joe, and they didn't even go to the ceremony or the reception.
Whoa.
No, they didn't like him at all. They could see what he was like. Now, Joe started his graduate classes at Harvard while Sandra worked as a secretary full-time to pay the tuition.
Now, Joe left Harvard Business School after only a year. He had a knee injury that led to his surgeon telling him to take the year off. So Joe got a job at Standard & Poor's in New York, and he managed high-risk funds. By then, he was beginning to drink heavily. Now, he and Sandra eventually opened their own securities analysis firm, which they named Argent.
Yeah, now this whole thing about the knee injury leading to him not going to college, I'm a little skeptical about that.
Well, there's something about that.
There's more to it, at least, yeah.
There has to be.
Because you don't need to drop out of business school for a knee injury.
No.
No, so there is something about that.
Now, by the late 60s, they were at the peak of their success. They managed $80 million in assets from their Wall Street office. Well, that's not bad. They were living the high life. They rented a duplex penthouse in southwest Greenwich Village, and they bought a country house in Monterey, Massachusetts. But Joe's drinking was getting more and more out of control, and combined with a terrifying temper, trouble was brewing. Outbursts ended with every piece of furniture in the home destroyed. According to Sandra, his rages came out of nowhere. She was usually able to run away from him because he was drunk, but he would destroy anything in his reach. Once, right after they'd spent a small fortune having a decorator do their apartment to make it look like a country home, Joe went on a rampage and ruined everything. Sandra soon learned that Joe absolutely identified with his violent father. Now, not just the furniture, but Sandra soon became a target. Joe hit her, he threw heavy objects at her, and he threatened to kill her. Now, so why did such a smart woman allow her husband to treat her so badly?
Well, in those days, the late 60s, early 70s, domestic violence wasn't really even a thing. It was only known in clinical and academic circles, really, and the term battered women didn't exist until 1973. So basically, a man's use of force against his wife was often accepted. And I think part of that is because there were no female authorities, no shelters, no hotlines, and not even any treatment centers. So women who were physically endangered by their husbands could be kind of invisible, or worse yet, people would say, well, they asked for it.
Yes, she wasn't being a good wife.
Right, exactly. So it's a bad position to be in. But I think Sandra, too, had her issues with dangerous, violent men, as Diane did. Now, despite Sandra and Joe having a very successful professional relationship, after 10 years of marriage, Sandra was trying to keep out of Joe's way as much as possible. She knew he was having many extramarital affairs at that time, and she'd given up on having children. Many times she would spend weekends alone in their country house. Now, at the end of one weekend, she drove back to New York earlier than planned, and she caught Joe in bed with a woman. The woman left in a hurry, and Sandra said to Joe, "I'm not going to put up with you rubbing your affairs in my face like this. Just don't do it in my own bedroom." So she was basically accepting it, but didn't want to be confronted with it. But when she said that to Joe, he lost his temper, not surprisingly. But what he did was he picked up a sculpture that Sandra had recently given him as a gift. Now, this was heavy. It was a cast iron bull and bear to celebrate their Wall Street victories. The sculpture was so heavy he had to lift it with both hands, and he slammed it down on the back of Sandra's head. So that could have been fatal.
You're no kidding.
Sandra fell down a flight of stairs and actually lost consciousness. And she woke up on the floor hours later, soaked in blood. Joe had just left her there and gone to bed. So she ran upstairs, got her purse, and drove off towards her parents' house. Now, it took 8 hours to get from New York to Mystic, Connecticut, where her parents lived, because she kept having to pull over to the side of the road and vomit. Finally, she passed out and hit a cement barrier on the Connecticut Turnpike. She woke up on impact and drove herself to a motel, where she asked the desk clerk to call a doctor. He refused, which I don't know why. That's just weird. So she checked into a room and called her parents, who then called the Connecticut State Police, who came and took her to the hospital. So Sandra told the doctor that her husband had hit her on the head with a large sculpture, and the doctor laughed at her. Now, she was wearing her riding clothes, and the doctor looked her in the eye and said, "Oh, come on, you just fell off a horse, honey." So that was that. That was the end of it. So that gives you some idea of how things were for battered women back then.
It does. Not a good picture.
Not a good picture at all.
So by the early 1970s, Sandra was living separately from Joe in a rented house in Massachusetts. Now, when Sandra would mention the possibility of divorce, Joe threatened to send people to kill her, or kill her himself. After one threat in 1973, she and her mother went to a lawyer to get a restraining order against Joe. Now, by this time, not only was he drinking, Joe was using cocaine and amphetamines. He was losing his business, he had grown his hair long, and he was extremely hyper. Well, amphetamines can do that to you, can't they?
Well, cocaine and amphetamines, not a good mixture for Joe.
So he began to keep guns in the office. That's nice. And his threats towards Sandra became more explicit, and they were witnessed by limousine drivers that he hired to take him around the city. He tipped drivers $100 to do crazy things. Once, he had one of them take him to a secluded area outside the city and stop the car. While the driver waited behind the wheel, Joe got out, tacked a photo of his wife Sandra to a tree, and started firing at the photo with a pistol until it was all torn up with bullets. Another driver got tipped $100 to drive Joe and Sandra upstate. During the drive, Joe told the driver to stop the car. He got out holding a shovel. Then he started digging a grave by the side of the road. And according to the limo driver, Joe then told Sandra that after he killed her, he's going to bury her there.
I just can't imagine how she was living with this. She finally did go ahead and divorce Joe, but she lived in terror. On the day the divorce became final, she got calls at her new home from both her lawyer and Joe's, both warning her to leave because Joe had sent 2 men out to hurt her. Now, Sandra refused to leave the house, but she did call the police, who sent a police car out with the sirens on. And those police arrived just as 2 men in a car with New York license plates showed up at her house. Possibly hitmen? We don't know.
Don't know.
But one of them was in her garage and the other was in his car when they heard the police siren, and they left. I guess the police didn't catch them.
No, but they didn't do anything.
Now, Joe and Sandra's business, Argent, was dissolved and Sandra got a divorce. Joe spent the rest of that year drunk. Then in late 1975, he started going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and he applied for an almost entry-level job with Argus Research Investment, a Wall Street research firm. Joe was hired, and after 2 years, his small salary was doubled. And that's about the time he met Diane. He had been in AA for 2 years, and he knew it wasn't recommended that people in recovery date until they're sober for at least 1 year. But Joe pursued Diane right away anyway.
So in early 1978, Joe and Diane had their first date. And on their second date, as she would later tell her friends, he spat on her during an argument at a restaurant. Now this, she said, fascinated her. Come on.
Can you imagine? Well, she had issues.
I guess so. Then early the next morning, Joe called her on the phone, waking her up, and insisted that she go to the ballet with him that night. She thought he was crazy.
Yeah, but she liked that. That's the problem.
Yeah, it turned her on, I guess.
Yeah.
And at this time, Diane had convinced herself that her taste in strange men was a sophisticated quirk, just part of her New York identity. Yeah, let's delude ourselves a little bit more.
She really did. And despite that image she put forward, she was not feeling secure when she began seeing Joe. She was really anxiety-ridden about the prospect of dating, just as she was getting sober, so part of her knew it wasn't smart. But Joe did pursue her pretty vigorously. Giving in to his advances was a way for her to not be alone anymore. And Joe could be charming and sweet at times. He really seemed to understand that his violent temper was his weakness, and the main reason he had wanted to get sober in the first place was to control his temper. Now, in getting sober, Diane was giving up the thing that had really enabled her to make life interesting and exciting, and that was drinking. Now, that's a lot like a manic depressive who doesn't want to take the medication because then you lose that excitement of the mania, right?
Right.
So not drinking was a really difficult sacrifice for her, for her self-image even. But Diane found in Joe a way to keep the excitement and the peril in her life and be sober at the same time. And then with Diane, Joe had found a person with whom he could rebuild his personal life. At the same time, he rebuilt his professional life. So as they worked towards solving their drinking problems together, they just created like this deeper dysfunction, and neither one of them would ever recover from that. Just months into their relationship, Diane got pregnant. Now, because Joe had been told by a doctor that his sperm count was too low for him to impregnate a woman, they were both really surprised. But the pregnancy pushed them into a premature commitment. Diane was almost 35 and so determined to have a baby that she became obsessed with it. The pregnancy was kind of seen like a miracle to her. She and Joe planned to be married, and Joe was really excited about the baby. Growing up poor, he wanted his child to have the life that he never had.
So Diane began looking for apartments for them, and she eventually found an affordable place in the village. But all was not well. That's not a surprise, is it?
No.
Joe was so jealous. He accused Diane of having affairs pretty much throughout her pregnancy. Now, while he was only making $50,000 a year, he still wanted Diane to quit her job. So she agreed to this, and Joe did begin to make more money. So Joe, Diane, and their parents traveled by limo to an estate called the Dreamworld Inn, where the marriage was officiated by a justice of the peace. They honeymooned in the Caribbean, then moved into the new apartment. Not long after they'd moved in, Diane called a friend of hers and told her that Joe had smashed all her mother's china when he was pissed off.
Yeah, and her mother had recently passed away as well, so it was very heartbreaking for her. And I think that probably added to her vulnerability at that stage of her life.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Now, Diane did have her baby. It was a little girl, born February 1st, 1979, at St. Vincent's Hospital, which is just down the street from their apartment. Now, right after the birth, Joe called Diane's dad, Diane Whitmore, sounding pretty elated, really happy. Baby was named Claudia Jackson, after Diane's grandfather, Claude Jackson. And not long after the birth, Joe moved on to a better-paying job, and they hired a nanny. At this point, Diane was not going to return to her job, so she's totally dependent on Joe for her financial support.
So I just want to take a short break here to let our listeners know that we're adding another benefit for True Crime Brewery Premium subscribers. So in addition to getting bonus and ad-free episodes, I'm going to be releasing new episodes one day early for our members. So our members will get ad-free versions of the show on Sunday nights, and then we'll release the show as normal on Monday nights. If you're interested and would like to support the show while getting these benefits, check it out at tiegrabber.com/subscribe. Or if you prefer, you can get these same benefits as a patron at patreon.com. Also, for those of you who listen on the website, we've made some repairs to the audio player, so now you can pause the show and it'll keep your place when you want to resume. Also, a quick reminder that you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com or leave us a voicemail from your phone or computer by clicking on the link in our show notes or by going to our website. You can also help out the show by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And however you support us, we appreciate you and we thank you for being here at the quiet end with us.
Back to our story. So Diane and Joe stopped attending their AA meetings, but stories got back to other members that Joe was beating her. Diane kept what abuse there was to herself, so she would appear to be a happy, upscale Wall Street wife. In 1980, she and Joe moved to a duplex at 6th Avenue and 10th Street. Diane hired an interior designer to decorate it. Now, the result was elegant, but simple and unpretentious. Now, this was a part of her life that Diane had waited a long time for. But, and here's the big but, came with a huge price.
Absolutely.
Diane reported to friends that Joe had stopped his physical abuse of her, but he'd begun abusing her verbally. He had a habit of waking her up in the middle of the night, tell her that she was a piece of shit. She must have been at the bottom of her class at Mount Holyoke, that she would never amount to anything. Sometimes he'd threaten to lock her in the bathroom overnight.
Yeah, Diane's father visited in the winter of 1981, and walking with him through the city streets, pushing Claudia in her stroller, Diane confided to her father what was really going on in her marriage. She told him that Joe insulted and mistreated her on a regular basis and that she really didn't see it ever improving. She said that she was thinking of leaving him, but her father told her to stick it out if she could. He said, you have a young child and you can't just run off and get a divorce. Besides, he told her, Joe's making more money now and he'll probably treat you better from now on. So I'm sure her father would regret that. Now, by the summer of 1981, Joe was making a lot more money, and that's when they bought the vacation house in Amagansett, Long Island, one of the fashionable communities on the East End. It was really a mark of privilege to summer in the Hamptons. The wife, child, and babysitter would generally spend the whole summer at the house, while the husband commuted there on weekends. The status of this arrangement meant a lot to Diane and Joe. But when Joe wasn't there with her, he called the house all day. Most of the phone calls were filled with him screaming at Diane. During one of Joe's phone calls to the house, Diane told Joe that she and a woman friend were about to go out to dinner at a restaurant that had just opened nearby, but he did not want her to go. The friend heard Diane fighting with him and realized that the relationship had really changed her friend Diane. Diane was screaming almost as much as Joe was. And after she hung up the phone, Diane said, well, we can still go, but when he sees the charge on his Amex bill, he'll be furious. But the friend said, oh no, I think that we just won't go. She was trying to avoid them having a fight. But Diane almost seemed to enjoy pissing off Joe. Maybe it was the excitement she had been missing since she got sober. But her friend really did begin to fear for Diane's safety.
But you can see this. Two dysfunctional people, each doing things to try to hurt the other.
Yes, it happens. It does. But of course, he's very dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she's dangerous to herself.
Exactly. So hiring another interior decorator, Diane began furnishing her vacation house. She designed Claudia's bedroom by herself, thinking that if all went well, it would be a room shared by Claudia and a sibling one day. Diane wanted to spare Claudia from the loneliness of being an only child, so Joe had his vasectomy, which he'd had done after Claudia's birth, reversed.
Yeah, so in the summer of 82, Diane was pregnant again. Joe's jealousy was now something that she was kind of used to. Possibly because of his codependent relationship with his own mother, Joe's jealousy got worse when Diane became pregnant. One day in the middle of her pregnancy, Jeff Bartholomew, the husband of Diane's friend Pat Bartholomew, stopped by the duplex to return a book Diane had loaned to Pat. In the middle of Jeff's visit, Joe called Diane from his office. According to Pat, after Diane got off the phone, she told Jeff he'd better leave. Then Joe called Pat at work and started yelling at her, telling her he was going to kill her husband. So Pat's really worried and she tried to reach Jeff at their house, but the phone just kept on ringing. So she rushed home. Shortly after she got inside, the doorbell buzzer went off, and when she answered the intercom, it was Joe. He was at their place saying he had a gun and was there to kill Jeff. Pat told him she was calling the police, and then he did give up and leave. But unfortunately, this kind of abuse by Joe caused Diane's friends to distance themselves from the couple. It was just too much for a lot of them, even though they cared about Diane.
Yeah, but you can't be witnessing that stuff.
Well, especially when he starts threatening to kill you or your husband.
No shit. So Joe went to San Francisco on a business trip when Diane was 7 months pregnant. She flew out there to meet him, leaving Claudia with their live-in Swedish babysitter. Now, on the second evening of the trip, Diane and Joe went out for dinner. And on the way back to their hotel, while driving down a side road in the dark while it was raining, they had an argument in their rental car. So in a rage, Joe pushed Diane out and then sped away. Diane called her father in tears when she did manage to get to another hotel later that night. Now, her father was shocked that Joe would do that, especially in a strange city with her pregnant. So he offered to buy her a plane ticket home. But instead of flying back home to New York, Diane stayed in that hotel, hiding out from Joe for 3 more days.
Yeah, it was definitely a dysfunctional relationship, and Diane had developed a habit of raising the stakes when she and Joe had these conflicts. The way she had normalized danger in her life made it really difficult for her to make decisions that were in her own best interest. And her ambivalence about giving up the lifestyle of a wealthy wife, and her fear of being unable to take care of her children and herself, kept her in this marriage. So Diane gave birth to her son, Blake Joseph Pikul, in December 1982. Right before the birth, their Swedish nanny had left because of incidents with Joe. But she passed her job on to a Swedish friend, a young clothing designer named Carina Jacobson. She did warn her about Joe beforehand, but this girl took the job. Now, one of the worst fights Carina would witness happened early in her time with the Pikuls. This was in the spring of 1983. They were on a family trip she took with them and the children to Boston. And Joe had spared no expense. He booked a suite at the Ritz-Carlton, and he gave Carina no limits with the room service. On the second morning of their trip, a rainy day that required some umbrellas, Joe, Diane, and Carina and the children were out window shopping. Then all of a sudden, Joe and Diane started to fight. Carina wasn't paying much attention to what they'd been talking about, but it seemed like the anger just came out of nowhere. Joe started it, but then Diane became furious. They were hitting each other with their fists. Then Diane got so angry that she hit Joe with her umbrella. He hit her back with his, and it went on this way for a few minutes. People in the stores were looking at them through the windows in disbelief. I can't even imagine. You've got this wealthy Manhattan couple with children and a nanny, and they're fighting each other with umbrellas.
Yeah, I'm picturing a duel, like dueling umbrellas.
I know. Now, when this umbrella fight finally ended, Diane left with Carina and the children in their rental car. And being, kind of a normal person, Carina expected that they were driving to the train station to go back to New York. But then Diane turned around and drove back to the hotel, where Joe was just lying down for a nap. So it was like nothing at all had happened between them. Carina never learned what had started this fight, but then some audio recordings Joe made of an argument with Diane would later reveal that it had been anger by Diane at Joe having a homosexual affair while she was breastfeeding Blake. Now, Diane was breastfeeding Blake during this Boston trip, so his homosexual affair may have happened on that trip.
So this is a confirmed affair? He was bisexual?
I don't know.
Okay.
But he did possibly have the homosexual tendencies. I don't know if that was ever proven. But Diane believed that he had had affairs with both men and women.
Okay. Now, by the mid-'80s, Joe was making almost $800,000 a year. Not bad. This affluence to Diane was a dream come true. And because of that, she was determined to make the marriage work. Now, Joe, for his part, knew exactly how to manipulate Diane. She had spent her childhood listening to cautionary tales about the depression from her parents. So Joe was like a controlling parent with Diane, and their relationship was like a vicious circle. They'd fight, she'd leave, and then he would bribe her to stay for a certain amount of money. Sometimes he would threaten to drop out of Wall Street if she left and hide his money from her. And Joe's threats always worked. Seemed to be Diane's fear of being poor that kept her with Joe. Now, she did eventually overcome some of her fears to begin working towards her independence. She had the outside of her life figured out and appeared to have her life together, but she didn't feel confident that she was worth anything on the inside.
Yeah, that makes it tough.
Yes, it does.
She did consider taking the children and disappearing. On vacation in Washington, D.C., with Joe and the children when they were 7 and 3, she met a woman friend in Virginia. She confessed to this friend that her life with Joe had become unbearable, but her fear that Joe would track her down if she left with the children was just too much for her to overcome. She did begin to work on her fear of writing, and she began a few stories about her life. Eventually, she read parts of these to her friend, Carolyn Gazer, a poet and contributor to the New York Times Book Review. Now, according to Gazer, Diane was very touchy about the subject of her writing. As long as she never tried to make good on her dream of being a writer, she was safe from feeling like a failure. But to make things worse, her writing was threatening to Joe. And she was very afraid of writing at home, where Joe could go through her things to see what she was writing. Diane was also uncovering some secrets about Joe. One day in the spring of 1986, she found a pair of women's stockings in Joe's briefcase, but they were very large stockings, and she couldn't imagine any woman wearing them. Not long after that, Diane went up into Joe's attic room, which had always been off limits to her and the children. And there she found pictures and videotapes of Joe wearing women's underwear and sexually pleasuring himself. And this was disturbing to Diane. Diane's New York City women friends knew about the abusiveness and the danger of her marriage, and they all advised her to leave. But many couples who socialized with the couple believed that they were a normal family. These couples all had young children close to Blake and Claudia's ages, and Diane and Joe often socialized with them in the Hamptons. They had weekend barbecues in one another's yards, played board games together, and they would hire babysitters so they could all go out to dinner together. The men basically talked about business and real estate, and the women, who were much closer because they spent summer weekdays together as well as weekends, discussed their children's horseback riding classes, day camps, and summer nursery school. The Pikuls would take kids miniature golfing, and Diane would attend lectures at the town hall. So it all seemed very normal from the outside.
Then on the 4th of July in 1986, the Pikuls and two other couples celebrated the holiday by going to a dinner party and then to a fireworks show. Joe took off when he saw a souvenir vendor and came back with sparkling pinwheels for all the kids. Joe was dressed in loafers, chinos, a Brooks Brothers crew neck sweater over a Lacoste shirt. How preppy.
Very preppy.
Diane looked very together in her designer sundress. And as the fireworks went off over the ocean, the Pikuls appeared to everyone like the perfect family. But a couple days later, Hampton neighbor Leslie Griffith said to Diane, "Joe is so great." And Diane shocked her by shaking her head and saying, "You don't know him." She then told Leslie that in the middle of an argument recently about Diane wanting to go back to work, Joe had taken Diane's contact lenses out of their case, thrown them on the floor, and stomped on them until they were pretty much obliterated. Then a few weeks after that, standing in the playground of a local day camp watching their children play, Diane told another friend that she wanted to divorce Joe. Diane talked about how she's trying to come up with a plan so she could leave him, but then she said, I can't leave him, because if I did, he would kill me. And from her tone, the friend knew that Diane wasn't exaggerating. She meant it, and she was scared to death.
Well, for one thing, Diane really had no money of her own. Joe kept her under his thumb by leaving virtually no money in their joint checking account. There were certain days when, in the process of transferring funds from one account to another, Joe did keep some money in the joint account, but only briefly. So Diane began calling the bank by phone number, which is what they had before they had internet banking, to see what was in the account. So on one of those days when there was money in the joint account, she might be able to get her hands on enough money to hire a lawyer and buy plane tickets to stay with a friend she had in Colorado. Diane didn't think Joe knew about her daily calls to bank by phone or her plans to leave him, but one incident that July when Joe was in the city terrified her. After getting into her car to take the children to a local fair, her car wouldn't start. Turns out the engine had been tampered with so it wouldn't start. And when she looked, she saw that all of the tires were flat as well. Joe showed up at the house the next day, and Diane accused him of sabotaging her. And not surprisingly, this led to a big fight. Joe ended up screaming at their housekeeper, who ran off down the street. And Diane finally called herself a divorce attorney.
Her new attorney suggested she get a restraining order against Joe, but she declined. She explained to him that her husband was a very strange person. He could kill her and run away with the children. And at a later meeting, she gave the attorney the videotapes she had found. As he got to know her over the next year or so, her attorney realized that Diane was controlled by Joe. He had to know where she was every single minute of every single day. In some of the videotapes, Joe was wearing a garter belt and panties, and he was masturbating to a recording of Here Comes the Bride.
That's a weird choice.
I'm trying to picture that.
No, don't.
Diane and her attorney had no plans to do anything with the pictures and videotapes, but they kept them just in case.
Well, I think Diane really didn't want to because she knew it would just set him off more. But the attorney said, well, let's hold on to them. We might need them.
Oh, I can see that.
So he held on to them. Diane's friends were really relieved when she told them that she was finally taking the long overdue step of divorcing Joe. She seemed beyond being angry at him. She had thought it through and said that she was able to reconcile the good and the bad parts of Joe, But they all believed that Joe's reaction to being served divorce papers would be so severe that Diane would know that she was doing the right thing just by seeing his behavior. But Joe surprised her. Her attorney served the initial divorce summons to Joe at his office on a weekday in August. Diane was afraid Joe would kill everyone near him when he got that summons, and she was prepared to take off for the airport with the children. But, far from being enraged, Joe was apologetic and conciliatory. Leaving his office right after the papers were served, he drove from the city out to the vacation house with flowers, and he promised Diane that he would change for her. Now, she should have known better, but Diane fell for it. And I think part of that is she just wanted things to be different.
Well, she's still not wanting to give up the lifestyle.
No, she doesn't.
Diane was particularly relieved when Joe told her that he accepted the fact that she knew about his cross-dressing. Now all the secrecy was over, and they could repair the marriage. Diane's friends, however, were not convinced, and they were frustrated when, intent on saving their marriage, Diane and Joe started going to couples counseling.
Yeah, they really didn't think it was at the point where that could work. It had gone beyond that. But in February of 1987, apparently feeling better about things, Diane enrolled in a writing workshop at New York University. Now, she was bubbly and friendly, and she was a very promising writer with a strong voice. As their children played in the playground one afternoon, Diane told a friend, "What difference does it make if I find a great job and become a writer and leave Joe? I'll just end up with another man like him. I just don't know how to break this cycle." So poignant. She did have some insight there.
She did, but I don't know if she's trying to work on that.
Well, no, she'd said that it's pretty much a lost cause is what she was saying. I think she'd kind of given into it, at least at that point.
We're beyond all that.
At least at that point.
In March, Harper magazine editor Louis Lapham's assistant Ann Stern put an ad in the Village Voice for an assistant to publisher Rick MacArthur. The starting salary was $22,500 per year, and it attracted people in their 20s who seemed pretty immature and unreliable. But one caller sounded very different. Diane had called about the position, and she sounded intelligent, sophisticated, articulate, and very literate. And the people at Harper's were very happy to give the position to a stable adult with literary ambitions.
And she did seem really stable. She accepted the job on one condition, that she be able to leave the office twice a week from 2 to 3:30 to take her son to appointments with his speech therapist. So this condition was agreed to, and Diane started work at Harper's that April. Of course, Joe hated the thought of Diane working. Diane laughed about Joe being so mad that she was working, he might burn the Harper's building down. Now her new colleagues nervously laughed at what they saw as her black humor. But over the next several weeks, Diane made Joe's aggressive paranoia the subject of many of her funny stories. At Harper's, she befriended the women in their 20s for the most part. She was like their nurturing older sister, and she was very witty and worldly. They laughed when she told shocking stories about her husband. When editorial assistant Catherine Hopkins began dating Harper's assistant editor Rick Marin, Diane was her confidant. Catherine was well-educated and an aspiring writer herself. Rick was the TV critic at the Washington Times. When Catherine and Rick became engaged, Diane, who had known Catherine for only 2 months, organized the wedding and arranged for their honeymoon at the Windmill Inn, which was just down the street from her vacation house. When the couple arrived at their room at the inn, they found a basket of gourmet items and funny maps and descriptions that Diane had drawn of the community, and the note said, "The elves have been here." So it was kind of extraordinary, the effort she put in for someone she didn't know very well at all.
Someone who she'd fairly recently met.
Yes.
Yeah. But it was probably with advertising assistant Linda McNamara that Diane had her closest friendship at work. Diane entertained her with stories from her days working at Life magazine and her nights in the discos. Linda loved Diane's style, her stories, and her fashion. By the beginning of the summer, Diane had stopped talking about Joe's actions with her casual black humor. By this time, she had become absolutely terrified of him.
Well, Joe developed a serious cocaine addiction in the 80s. In August of 87, his eccentricities began to turn into actual madness. He was abroad frequently, investigating Scandinavian condom manufacturers because the AIDS epidemic had made these companies very good investments. His phone calls to Diane from hotel rooms remained very edgy and threatening, though. By now, Joe had learned that he was HIV positive. So the eventuality of his death plagued him. Remember, in the 80s, it was a death sentence.
It was. You got exposed somewhere.
Yes. I don't think that he was using IV drugs, so probably it was sexually transmitted.
Yeah.
He did confide in his ex-wife, Sandra, who for some reason was always there for him. He called her from overseas at all hours, and he would ramble on, often berating Diane for leaving the children with a different babysitter every night. Sandra, not knowing Diane or the situation, did show him some sympathy, and she didn't discourage his calls at all. She knew how to cope with them, and she allowed them. Once when he called at 3 a.m., Sandra left the phone off the hook and fell back asleep. When she woke up hours later, there was a telephone company worker at her door. They had been concerned about the length of the call, because on the other end of the line, Joe was still talking. He had just gone on talking. Didn't even notice.
But it was probably Joe's calls to Diane that more clearly revealed his damaged mental state. He was stalking her from his hotel room across the ocean. Joe returned from these trips with suitcases full of sample brands of condoms, and he stored them in drawers in the Amagansett beach house. By September of 1987, Diane's attorneys, Raoul Felder and David Slavin, went to Joe's attorneys to get a statement of Joe's net worth. Joe's lawyers stonewalled him. Joe was telling Diane that he fully intended to sue for custody of the children, and that she would lose against him because her salary is laughable and she is virtually penniless.
But that doesn't seem right, because he should have to pay alimony and everything.
Yeah,
so I don't know why she would believe that.
That's kind of an irrational fear. Diane was trying to do everything she could not to resort to using Joe's cross-dressing pictures and videos, but Joe knew that her attorney had them, and that the attorney wanted to use the photos and videos to get Joe to comply. But Diane would not allow that.
No, Diane did suspect that Joe might have the AIDS virus. At that time, AIDS panic and misinformation were really rampant. Some people were even bringing their own silverware and dishes to restaurants. In a tape recording that Joe secretly made in the Amagansett house, Diane is heard confronting him. And she says, "You're hiding your AIDS from me." And then she says, "I probably have the AIDS virus too, but I'm too scared to go for a test." In this recording, Joe says repeatedly that this is absolutely ridiculous when she asks him to get an AIDS test. Then finally Joe warns her, "You haven't seen anything yet, Diane." So more threats.
And on the tape, Joe, who was apparently making the recording for his own legal benefit, provoked Diane into telling him just what she thought of him. "You're a nasty, cowardly bully. You're a liar. You're a cheat. You're dishonest. You're dishonorable. You're mean. You're nasty and psychotic. And I don't want to live with you, and I want to see you as little as possible."
Well, that's clear.
I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Although she then scolds him again for borrowing her clothes. Now, by this time, Joe was trying to talk his ex-wife, Sandra, into signing a document agreeing to become a legal guardian for his children in the event of the death of both him and Diane.
So that's a strange choice, huh?
Isn't it? And Sandra could never figure out why he kept asking her. He had told her that he was HIV positive, but why wouldn't Diane be there for her children? When she asked, Joe just shrugged and suggested that Diane might be in some kind of an accident.
Yeah, that's strange.
Uh-huh.
In October of 87, Diane wrote a 5-page memo to her attorney. By now, Joe had moved into an apartment of his own, and Diane wrote that it was time to get a divorce once and for all. She said she could no longer put up with Joe's erratic behavior. She was struggling to take classes, build a career, and raise normal, happy children in what she called a confusing environment in which the threat of abuse and violence of one kind or another is constant. So she wrote, "Please help me to resolve this horrible situation as quickly as possible for all of our sakes. It is now time, I fear, for the World War III you promised me we would have, if necessary." So now she's all in, it sounds like. So on Monday, October 19th, Diane went to her office and she talked to her friend, Linda McNamara. Diane told her that Joe had asked her to go to their house in Amagansett that Friday to spend one last family weekend together. While there, they would divide the furniture up and prepare the house for sale. Diane was tempted to go because it was important for her to get the house ready to sell and sort out their property. Plus, she didn't really like the kids being alone with Joe. Later that morning, Diane made an appointment to look at a rental house for her and her children to move into. The next day, Diane called the children's nanny, Karina, and asked her to go to Amagansett with the family that weekend. Karina told her she'd think about it. Then the next day, Diane cried to another friend about the divorce and all of the stress she was under. Joe left a message on Karina's answering machine asking her to join them in Amagansett. This was really strange because Joe had never asked her to join them before. He rarely called her.
Then on Thursday, October 22nd, Joe's ex-wife Sandra arrived in New York. Sandra was still asking for $38,000 in outstanding alimony, even though they had been divorced for 13 years. Joe had invited her there for lunch, promising to give her the money. But again, he asked her to sign the paper to take custody of his children in the event of his and Diane's deaths. Sandra again refused. Later that evening, Joe introduced Sandra to his children, Claudia and Blake. Sandra left New York that evening after again refusing to sign the custody paper.
He was actually very nice to her. It was strange. He was so nice to her.
He wanted something from her.
Exactly. So that same day, Karina called Diane and told her she wouldn't be able to make it to the vacation house with them that weekend after all. Diane decided that she wouldn't go either then. But then, for an unknown reason, she changed her mind. She did say she didn't want to leave the children alone with him all weekend. So Diane fed and bathed the children and kissed them goodbye as they drove off to the vacation house with their father. She stayed in the duplex straightening up, changing her clothes, and then took herself out to dinner. After withdrawing some money from her bank's ATM, she walked to the parking garage. So it was 10 p.m. that Friday when Diane drove her Buick station wagon out of the garage onto 10th Street near 7th Avenue in Greenwich Village. She turned left onto 6th Avenue and drove past the building that housed her duplex apartment. Joe and the children were already at the family's Amagansett house by now, having left in his car about 3 hours earlier. Joe was settling himself and the two children into the one-story house on Windmill Lane as Diane drove through traffic. Joe carried 4-year-old Blake, asleep, into the children's bedroom. Claudia, then 8 years old, watched a video in the babysitter's room. Then, after Claudia fell asleep, Joe put her to bed in the same room with her little brother. So Joe likely sat in the kitchen after that, eating a cheesecake that he had bought at the local country store. He often ate compulsively when he was agitated, and on this night he definitely was. He had a lot on his mind.
So Joe called Diane's garage to find out exactly what time his wife had left with the station wagon, and then he waited for her. Friday night traffic on the Long Island Expressway and the Montauk Highway could be heavy, and Diane didn't get to Windmill Lane until sometime between 1:15 and 1:30 in the morning. She parked in the gravel area in front of the house. Joe may have been waiting near the front windows, close enough to hear her slam the car door. Or he may have been pacing inside the house. We don't know. The couple may have argued about how late Diane had arrived, and if the arguing was especially heated and out of control, it would have been consistent with their previous fights. But next-door neighbors didn't hear any yelling, any screaming. Then another possibility of what happened when Diane arrived was that she was ambushed by Joe, and there wasn't any arguing at all. Either with his hands or with a blunt object, Joe beat Diane about the head sometime after she walked through the door. In trying to defend herself, Diane knocked out one of her husband's teeth, but she was very thin and small, and he was much bigger and stronger. Diane was murdered by her husband as her two children slept upstairs.
Well, we hope they were asleep, right?
We hope so.
The head trauma would have killed Diane, but her death was hastened when Joe put his hands around her neck and strangled her. In her attempts to stop him and breathe, Diane pushed her fingers between her neck and his grip. Deep fingernail scratches on her own skin came from this attempt to save herself. Now lastly, Joe took a pink plastic cord and wound it around Diane's neck. And after Diane was dead, he would clean up the house, Then after a trip to the beach where he would attempt to bury her body in the sand, he rolled her up in plastic sheets and tied her neck, wrists, and ankles with different cords. The theory that Joe planned the murder of Diane and lied in wait for her is supported by his saying to his ex-wife Sandra that Diane might have an accident, and by his flying Sandra into the city the day before and introducing her to his children. It is also supported by his calling the city garage to find out exactly when Diane left so he could prepare for her arrival. Nanny Karina Jacobson believed that Joe was planning to kill Diane that weekend, and the reason he wanted her there so badly was that she could have the children somewhere else while he did it. But Karina didn't go there this weekend, and Joe had to kill Diane while the children were there, hopefully asleep.
I hope so. Diane's murder was a messy scene. She was bleeding from head wounds, and the strangulation had induced vomiting. So Joe cleaned his dead wife with towels. Then he put her body in his car, along with a small barbell and an inflatable raft. He drove down Windmill Lane, past the cemetery, onto the eastbound Montauk Highway, then into the woods separating Amagansett from East Hampton. He continued driving through a series of narrow paths in complete darkness to a small clearing that opened onto the Bay Beach, which was called Little Albert's Landing. And at the landing, Joe dragged Diane's body through the sand close to the shore, but he never put her body in the water. Sometime while he was at the beach, Joe changed his mind about the idea of taking Diane's body out in the water and weighing it down with a barbell. In a hurry to get back to the house, he buried Diane's wrapped-up body in the sand, and then drove back to the house about 3:30 in the morning. And that's where he cleaned the raft off, hosed it, cleaned the bathroom, and checked on the children.
So next, Joe changed his clothes and fell asleep in a chair, and Claudia woke him up. Joel told his daughter that her mother had run out of the house. He made breakfast then and put her in the babysitter's room to watch TV. He got his bloody shirt and jeans and put them in the garbage to take to the dump. Then he watched some TV with Claudia. By 9 a.m., Blake was up, and by 9:30 the children were dressed and Joe drove them in the station wagon to the town dump. There he tossed the trash, which included his bloody clothes. After that, Joe drove with the children to Amagansett hardware store. It was 10:30 when he bought $325 worth of items, which included a shovel, a wheelbarrow, plastic lawn bags, fishing gloves, a flashlight, and rope, with his credit card. He then stopped at a delicatessen where he charged 12 bags of ice to keep Diane's body from decomposing and smelling while he decided how to dispose of it permanently. Then he drove the children back to the house.
Yeah, I think he's really losing it here.
He's lost it. Back at the house, Joe called his home security service to have the house's alarm codes changed. It's unclear if this was an effort to keep the police out or a way to make it seem like Diane had stormed off in a rage, and he was now blocking her from re-entering the house. Joe was also very anxious to replace the tooth that was now suspiciously missing from his mouth.
Yeah, that's a tough one to explain, isn't it?
Sure is. He called a local dentist for an emergency appointment and left this rambling message on the answering machine. When the dentist's office manager returned his call at 12:30 that day, Joe told her a story about how he had found another man's condoms under his bed and how his wife had walked out on him. That's pretty weird to say that to the dental person.
Right.
Why? Why would you do that?
I don't know. Maybe he thinks it's going to make his story more credible.
Yeah, sometimes people do that. They add more and more detail to make it seem more believable.
Don't do that.
No. Well, he next called his old Northeastern College roommate, Henry Sawaska, who now lived with his wife and children in the town of New Windsor. Joe told Hank that he had just gotten news from his doctor that he was dying, that he had found another man's condoms under his bed, and that Diane had just walked out on him. Joe and Hank actually hadn't seen each other in 9 years. Also, his house was at least 4 hours away from Amagansett. But Joe asked Hank if he could drive up with his children and stay overnight at Hank's house while he dealt with his difficult circumstances. So this was all very strange, but Hank was a nice guy. He was concerned for his old friend, so he said sure, and he invited Joe and the children to come to his house for dinner.
That's just amazing to me. He's had virtually no contact with this guy for years.
Yeah.
Calls him up out of the blue and invites himself and his kids over.
And it's not even close to where he is either. So he must have had a hard time thinking of someone he could turn to who wouldn't say, where's Diane?
And then at 11:45 in the morning, Marshall Weingarten called the house on Windmill Lane. Barbara Weingarten had gone out to run some errands, and she had asked her husband to call and confirm her plans with Diane to take the children to story hour at the East Hampton Library. Joe answered the phone and agreed with Marshall that story hour was a good idea for the kids. But Marshall thought that Joe seemed very nervous, and then Joe told him that Diane had quote-unquote disappeared.
That's a strange way to put it.
He went on to say that Diane hadn't arrived at the house until after 1 in the morning, the night before. And when he asked her why she was so late, she became angry and stormed out of the house. Marshall asked if Diane had taken a car, and Joe said no, which was strange because he couldn't walk anywhere from there. Then Joe said that he had found condoms in the living room, just lying there.
Yeah.
Because of this, he suspected that she had a boyfriend, and he suggested that Diane could have run off to be with this boyfriend.
Well, when Marshall suggested, maybe the condoms could have belonged to one of the babysitter's boyfriends, Joe just kept suggesting that Diane had left the house with another man. Joe occasionally interrupted this phone conversation to talk to a man from the alarm company who was at the house, changing the security codes. Before hanging up, Joe told Marshall that he just had bad news from the doctor that week, and that he was bringing the children to a friend's house upstate. He said that he had to hang up because he still had a lot of packing to do. So Marshall told Joe, well, you should bring the kids by our house and they can use our swimming pool. But Joe just kind of ignored that. He didn't even acknowledge it. He thanked Marshall and said he'd call him back later.
And then when Marshall's wife Barbara returned from her errands, Marshall told her about the strange conversation he'd had with Joe. And it troubled Marshall that Joe had used the word disappeared to describe Diane's leaving. Barbara suggested to her husband, well, Diane probably had gotten mad and was back in the city now.
Well, you can't blame her for thinking that because there have been so many arguments and strangeness with this couple.
Yeah.
You're probably kind of used to it.
All that stuff going on, sure.
Yeah. After lunch, Joe left the children in front of the TV and he went back to Little Albert's Landing. So he drove back to where Diane's body had been buried since 3 a.m., and he removed her body from the sand. He then laid some of the towels he'd taken from the house on one of the plastic tarps, put Diane's body on the towels on the tarp, and laid the ice on top of it. Then he rolled this whole thing up, putting more ice on it and rolling it again, like in layers. And he tied this entire bundle with the rope he'd bought at the hardware store. Then he put Diane's corpse back inside the back of the station wagon.
So this must be a relatively private place.
I would guess, because this is the middle of the day.
Daylight, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, he was. He did go back to the house after that and packed up the station wagon with the kids' clothes and toys, a knife, his shotgun, all that stuff. And he left with the children for Hank's house sometime between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Not long afterwards, he pulled off of the Long Island Expressway to make the first of many phone booth calls that he would make over the next 3 days. This call, like the rest, was paid for with coins to avoid them being traced back to him. So the number he dialed was Sandra's, his ex-wife, and he said he had something to hide and asked if he could hide it with her. Sandra told him that he could come to her house. Joe got lost several times on the way to her place in New Windsor. Given the news of their mother's disappearance, the mysterious long drive, and the erratic behavior of their sleep-deprived dad, the children must have felt that something was wrong. As they rode in the car, their mother's corpse was lying in a bundle right behind them.
That's just so grisly.
Isn't that horrible?
Ah.
Those poor kids. I mean, even if they didn't know, it's just horrible. So from another phone booth, Joe called Hank again and asked him not to have his wife Louise hold dinner for them. Then around 9:30 p.m., he dropped his 2 children with the Sawaskas, whom the children had never met, and said he'd pick them up the next day. So that's weird.
More than weird.
Then at about 10:20 p.m., he began a 6-hour drive to the south shore of Massachusetts, so towards his ex-wife's house.
Yes. So Sunday, October 25th, around 3:30 in the morning, Sandra was at her home in Norwell, Massachusetts, sleeping. Joe called her from a phone booth off the turnpike in Hartford. He wanted directions to her house. About a half hour later, he called her again, this time from a payphone in Norwell. He couldn't find the house. So Sandra agreed to go where he was, put on her raincoat, and got into her car. Now, he followed Sandra but stayed a good distance behind her. They got to her home about 4:30 in the morning, and Joe came into the house with a canvas bag and a shoulder bag. He paced back and forth, and then he came out with it. He said, "Where can I bury it?"
Yeah, so according to Sandra, at first he wouldn't tell her what he had to bury, but after several minutes of back and forth, he said, "I had to eliminate her." Sandra told him this wasn't a good place to bury a body on her property because of the high water table. Weird woman.
Yeah, I mean,
very practical speaking.
So, yeah, where can I bury this? Well, not here because there's too much water.
Yeah.
Nothing about talking to police or trying to...
No, there's certainly something wrong with her.
I guess.
Now, she would later rationalize her matter-of-fact reaction by saying that she just had to get Joe out of her house. But Sandra did give him some other burial suggestions, a nearby park and the section of the Berkshires in which their own weekend house had been located. She also offered to put Joe in touch with her friend, Vinnie Federico, Quincy, Massachusetts' former policeman who was now a defense attorney.
So after spending about 45 minutes at Sandra's, Joe left at 5:30 in the morning. Sandra's kind of scared.
I bet.
She had managed to reverse her own years of victimization by Joe by becoming his confidant. Now she had let herself become a witness in a murder case. Joe called Sandra several times again on Sunday. During the first call, he asked if she'd been able to reach Vinnie Federico yet, and she said no. She would later testify that she suggested Joe turn himself in, and he had hung up on her. Then Sandra left to take care of her aging mother, and when she returned home that evening, there were 2 messages from Joe on her answering machine. In the first message, Joe said he was in his hometown of Ware. He mentioned that he had found a possible burial site near the cemetery where his grandmother was buried, but then he had decided, it's too close to the road. The second message Joe left was from Tyringham, which is a rustic Berkshire's community. He and Sandra had once spent some weekends there. He said he couldn't do anything there because it was hunting season and people were walking around everywhere. Desperate, exhausted, running out of time, Joe spent the rest of the late evening driving around. He drove from Massachusetts to upstate New York and back looking for a burial site for Diane's body. When he couldn't find one, he returned to Manhattan, going to the 6th Avenue duplex after midnight and falling asleep. Diane's tarp-wrapped body was still in the back of the car, which was parked right out on the street.
Jeez.
Before Sandra went to sleep Sunday night, she erased Joe's messages from her answering machine.
Yeah, so I don't like her being secretive like that.
No.
Monday morning at 9:30 a.m., Diane, of course, was still not at her office at Harper's. Several of her colleagues were aware of this. Now, she was usually the first one there. Karen Hoffman at the reception desk would remember that one of the first calls that came in that morning was from Joe Pikul. He was calling from his car phone. He told her that Diane had disappeared over the weekend. Karen immediately suspected that he had killed her. Joe sounded especially nervous. Just moments before making this call, he had taken Diane's body out of the car and rolled it into a culvert on the side of the New York State Thruway. He had needed to get the body out of the car before he could pick up the children from his friend Hank's house. So he just kind of desperately left it somewhere that wasn't a good hiding spot.
Just basically by the side of the road.
Basically, yes. Now, after his 2-day search for a burial site, he had dumped her basically in a ditch. He had put a spare tire over her body in an effort to put off it being discovered.
Yeah, that'll work well.
It might buy you an hour, I don't know. But before driving to pick up his children from the now very concerned Louise Sawaska, she's got these children she's never met before at her house overnight.
Yeah, when are you coming?
Yeah. So he made a phone call to attorney Vinnie Federico. He wanted to talk to Sandra's lawyer friend and to fly the lawyer out to New York to help him out. After he picked up the kids, Blake and Claudia, he made a second call to Harper's Magazine, and he again spoke with Karen Hoffman. Just a few minutes later, Linda McNamara entered the reception area, and Karen said, "Linda, Diane hasn't come in yet, and Joe's been calling, acting like he's worried about her and looking for her." Everyone at the office was very worried. They knew her circumstances. And when Ann Stern arrived at 10 a.m., she realized that this was a very serious situation. So it was Ann that called the East Hampton and New York City police departments. She told them about Diane's fear of Joe and her plans to divorce him. She said that Diane was very reliable, and she would never fail to call to say she'd be late for work. And, of course, she would never just leave her children. But Anne was told there was nothing the police could do. An employee's late arrival for her job certainly didn't warrant any police intervention. And I hope that nowadays police are a little more keyed into these situations. You know, when someone's in that kind of situation, they don't need to be missing for very long to know something's terribly wrong.
Right. Listen to the story.
Yeah.
Joe continued to call Harper's. He called about 20 times, and he kept changing his story. First, he kept asking, "Where is she?" Then he started saying Diane had a boyfriend, and she'd run off with him that weekend. From there, he progressed to saying that they'd had a fight, and had gotten out of hand. And then he made a reference that scared the hell out of them, something about Diane rolling over.
He really isn't stable at all. He's totally out of it, and a loose cannon, I guess, is what they call it.
And the workers at Harper's learned that Joe had the children with him, and that alarmed them even more.
Sure.
So by noon, they had given up on doing any work, and they divided up the pages of Diane's Rolodex, calling any names that were Diane's friends, and not just business contacts. Everyone they talked to was worried that Joe had killed Diane, and everyone was concerned about the safety of the children. Nanny Karina was tasked with finding out where the kids were and if they were safe. So starting at around noon, she called Joe's secretary at his office. Joe wasn't there.
No, while Karina made calls, Joe drove back to New York. He stopped at a car wash in Newburgh, not far from where Diane's body was lying in a ditch. Joe wanted to have the station wagon thoroughly cleaned before he drove back into the city. The manager of the car wash was very suspicious of Joe's nervous behavior, his rambling talk about his wife just having run off with a man whose condoms were found under his bed, and the extensive detail that he wanted done to the trunk of his car. He wanted every little bit cleaned. The staff of the car wash watched as Joe walked to a nearby garbage can, then to a dumpster, and he started throwing out an unusual amount of trash. 2 of the car wash employees made a mental note to check out the bins as soon as Joe left. So they watched Joe as he reached into the car and took out a shotgun. He told the car wash manager, Jimmy Mitchell, that he could have the gun for just $25. So, of course, it wasn't common for a customer to offer to sell a shotgun for such a low price.
At a car wash.
Yes, or maybe to sell a gun at all.
Yeah.
But Mitchell was a hunter, and he was kind of happy about it. He bought it.
Sure, he got a bargain.
Thought it was a deal. While Mitchell went off into the surrounding woods to test out the new gun, 2 of his younger workers did a search of the dumpster. In the trash, they found a plastic card holder and a bunch of credit cards in the names of Diane Pikul and Diane Whitmore. When they mentioned the cards to Mitchell's wife, Lori, who worked as the car wash's cashier, she was very concerned. She told her husband about the cards when he returned from testing out the gun, and Mitchell took the cards. They also gave him a large rubber glove and a knife that they had found in the dumpster. They told him they had also seen some women's clothing inside the dumpster. So this set off some alarm bells.
You think?
Before he had left the car wash, Joe had called Sandra and left a message on her answering machine saying, "The package is down." Wow.
The eagle has landed. Joe returned home with Claudia and Blake about 3 o'clock that afternoon. By then, Vinnie Federico had agreed to represent him. Plans were made for Federico to be flown into Manhattan that day and to stay at a hotel at Joe's expense. As soon as Joe and the kids got home, Diane's friend Barbara Martin got through to him on the phone. Joe told her that he didn't have time to talk. He said that the car was double parked and the kids were down there in it. He said he would call her back in 30 minutes, and he hung up. While he was out moving the car to a parking space, Claudia picked up the house phone and called her mother's office at Harper's. "Do you know where my mommy is?" she asked.
Yeah, how heartbreaking.
Isn't it?
Yeah, because they pretty much knew he'd killed her.
Everyone.
Yeah, they just thought so. I mean, why wouldn't you?
I know. The receptionist tried to reassure Claudia, said that her mom's friends were all trying to find her.
Yeah, and in the meantime, Ann Stern was making insistent calls to the police, who had kind of been blowing it off. She knew that something bad had happened to Diane and decided she was not going to take no for an answer. When Diane's father, Don, heard that his daughter was missing, he himself called Joe. and Joe told Don it was none of his business where his wife was. Then Don called the East Hampton Police Department. Finally, he convinced them to send an officer to the Amagansett house. The house was locked up, though, and there was a padlock on the basement door, so the police had no authority to break in.
When Karina got Joe on the phone, she explained that she was concerned about the kids. Then he told her the condom story. And Karina knew that he was lying, but was able to convince him to let her come over and take care of the kids. So while Karina was canceling her previous plans in order to be with Blake and Claudia that night, a police patrolman named Greg Chrissy decided to get his patrol car washed. Chrissy and car wash manager Jimmy Mitchell had once worked together as ambulance technicians, and Chrissy had gone to high school with Mitchell's wife Lori. Chrissy's arrival gave Mitchell a chance to sort out what had happened earlier with Joe Pikul and discuss this with a friend of his who was in law enforcement. So he gave Chrissy the credit cards, the knife, and the glove his employees had reported finding in the dumpster, and suggested it might be worthwhile to take a look. Chrissy saw that what was in the dumpster was not normal messy car trash. Because he was officially off duty, he called in Patrol Officer Gary Cooper and his partner Margaret Hanson. Cooper and Hanson went through the dumpster and found a lot of women's clothes, jewelry, and shoes. And as they were sifting through the dumpster, Hanson looked at Cooper and said, "There's got to be a body that goes with this stuff," to which Cooper agreed.
Right. At the police station, officers Cooper and Hanson spread out and studied what they had found. There was a collection of over 50 items. One odd thing was that the credit cards were found with the jewelry and the clothing. And in most purse snatches and robberies, credit cards were discarded separately. Hanson also saw something else that was strange. According to the driver's license they'd found, the credit card owner was a small woman, 5'3" and 110 pounds. But the clothes they found in the dumpster were for a much larger woman. And the credit cards were all for expensive stores like Bloomingdale's and Saks Fifth Avenue. But the large clothes and jewelry were real cheap stuff. So Hanson called in their sergeant, a Mike Clancy. The discrepancies that Hanson and Cooper had found were significant to him, too. He also noted that the bras found were in different cup sizes. So he contacted the on-call detective, John Smith, and Smith drove over and looked at the items. He picked up an extremely large woman's pump and put it next to his own foot and said, "Hey, this would fit me. This is my size." So clearly this was stuff that Joe had been wearing.
Sounds like.
After seeing the items that were found in the dumpster, John Smith got Joe's phone number from Directory Assistance, and posing as a private citizen and using the name John Clancy, he spoke with Joe. He said that he was a Newburgh resident calling because he had just found a Mrs. Diane Pikul's credit cards in a garbage can. Joe acted shocked and he dropped the receiver. Then the detective began taping the conversation because he found Joe's response to be very suspicious. When Joe came back on the phone, he thanked John Clancy and said he would be sending a chauffeur to claim the lost cards and bring him a cash reward. Then within 5 minutes, Joe's chauffeur called to get directions. So the detective agreed to meet the chauffeur at the car wash in 3 hours. But after this call, Joe must have panicked because Joe called the police. And when Joe got an officer on the line, he immediately said, "My name is Joseph Pikul and I want to report my wife missing." The officer who took the call, Bill Glynn, had just gotten off the phone with Ann Stern from Diane's workplace. And Joe went on to tell Glynn his story of Diane's disappearance and how he thought she had run off with a boyfriend. Glynn believed Joe's story. It seemed to make sense to him, but he made plans to meet with him that night at 11 p.m.
So as Glynn hung up the phone, Detective John Smith from the Newburgh Police Department called. He wanted to know if they had anything on Joe Pikul. The officer who answered this call started taking notes. Now, he just happened to be sitting next to Detective Glynn, and when the officer left the desk, Glynn looked over and saw Joe's name on the notepad. So he picked up the phone and talked to Smith, asking him what's going on. So Smith told Glynn about the items that had been found in a dumpster at the car wash and the meeting planned with Joe's chauffeur for 9:30 that night. Glynn explained his side of the story, and that he had a meeting with Joe at 11. They both decided it was time to bring the Long Island police into the investigation. So the Amagansett house had been the last place Diane was known to have been in, and it was in the Long Island Police Department's jurisdiction. So Glenn and Smith contacted Long Island's senior investigator from the Major Crimes Unit, that's Donald Delaney, and it was decided that Delaney would join Glenn in his meeting with Joe that night.
So at 7:30, Karina arrived at the Pikuls' home. She would say that Joe was very nervous and he was constantly making phone calls. She also said that Claudia's hair was very dirty. And when asked about her mom, Claudia just shrugged her shoulders. Karina also noticed that Joe was missing a tooth. He told her that it had been loose and he had accidentally swallowed it. At dinner, Joe said that he was leaving with his driver. He also said that he was unplugging the phone, the home phone. He told Karina not to plug it back in. So Karina put the kids to bed. Of course, she didn't really believe that Diane was ever coming back, but she reassured the children as much as she could that their mom would be back soon. Joe had been calling the Newburgh police repeatedly because he thought the number belonged to a citizen named John Clancy. The detective, John Smith, though, didn't answer the phone, but he did notice a strange pattern. Joe would call, he'd let the phone ring 10 times, hang up, wait exactly 40 seconds, and then call again. So this was an odd guy.
Little OCD, too.
A little bit. So when Joe left the apartment, he met with attorney Vinnie Federico for the first time, and he paid him $5,000. After the chauffeur dropped off Joe with the attorney, he drove out to Newburgh to meet the citizen who had supposedly found Diane's credit cards. He arrived at the car wash at 9:40 p.m. There was an officer there posing as the cashier, and the plan was to follow the driver. When the driver walked up to the cashier, he asked if anyone else was there, and the cashier said that there was a man who'd been waiting around, but he had just left. So the chauffeur waited in his car for about half an hour. Detective Smith arrived in an unmarked car to watch the driver. The driver walked to a phone booth across the street, and then he was running back and forth between the phone and the car, making calls to Joe. When he continued waiting at the car wash, the cashier came up to him and told him that the car wash was closing. So the driver decided to leave, and Detective Smith followed him, and the police ordered the dumpster from the car wash to be picked up for inspection.
And at 11 p.m., Detective Glenn Delaney and a third police officer showed up at Joe's house, and Joe invited them in. He told them the story of Diane's disappearance, explaining that Diane had arrived at the vacation house about 1:30 in the morning, and they had had an argument. Joe said he then went to sleep after the argument, and Diane left the next morning while he was in the shower. But then later he changed that story and said that Diane had stormed off during the night. The police asked Joe if someone had picked Diane up, and Joe said that she had walked. But then he changed the story again and said he wasn't sure. Maybe she had been picked up by someone. And then when asked about her supposed boyfriend, Joe said he had no idea who it was. So the detectives asked Joe for permission to search the Amagansett house. He hesitated, but then he signed a consent to search. The police requested a piece of Diane's clothing, and Joe brought them a pair of panties and told them that Diane had worn them on a run, and they had not been washed. So he said it would give the dogs a good scent of her.
That's kind of creepy.
It is.
As the detectives left Joe's duplex, one remarked about how many times Joe had changed his story. And the third officer said he was surprised about how Joe didn't seem to give a shit about finding Diane. Delaney said that Diane was dead and Joe was the killer. He was convinced already. At 3 a.m., 2 New York City police officers showed up at Joe's duplex, and they wanted Joe to come in with them for questioning. Joe requested to come in later that day, but the police were worried that Joe would leave the state or even the country. So they insisted that he come with them, and he finally agreed. Joe told them that he knew the man who had called him about finding Diane's credit cards had actually been a police officer. He said that he had spent the weekend driving between Massachusetts and New York, but he had told the other detectives that he had stayed at Hank Sawaska's house.
Well, he can't keep his story straight.
No, that's a big problem. During this interview, Joe told the police that he had another apartment where he had moved to after he and Diane had separated. So the detectives asked if they could go there and search it, and he agreed. When police went down to that apartment, they saw a bedroom with no bed, and the place was filled with large-sized women's clothing, lipstick, and shoes. So the mystery of the large women's clothes and the cheap jewelry was solved. Joe told them that Diane liked him to dress in the women's clothing, and she liked to take pictures and video of him. And he added that she was trying to blackmail him with these pictures and videos. But that was all that was there. There was nothing to connect Joe to a murder.
Right. Then after the second apartment had been searched, the detectives took Joe back home. And at 8:30 in the morning, Detective Delaney and a Long Island forensics team went to search the Amagansett house. They found red stains on the kitchen floor. So Delaney stopped the search and had it secured with police guards as he went to get a search warrant so they could test for blood. So this delayed the search until about 6 o'clock in the evening. Forensics cut out pieces of the floor where the red stains were. Testing was positive for blood. They also found a set of knives which matched the knife that had been found in the dumpster at the car wash. And on the bedroom dresser, they found Joe's missing tooth.
Oh, so he hadn't swallowed it after all.
I guess he didn't swallow it, huh? It looked like Joe had been standing over Diane trying to kill her when Diane struck his face and knocked out a tooth. They did find condoms under the bed, but Delaney knew that Joe had been doing market research in Scandinavia on that exact same brand of condom. So he believed that Joe had planted them there.
Yeah, he'd done his homework early on. I was pretty impressed with him that he looked into that right away. In Joe's car that was still parked at the house, the police saw that the back seat was covered in sand, and the undercarriage of the car was covered with mud and beach grass. Police dogs went through the area but found nothing, and the house was kept secured while the detectives left. Meanwhile, Detective Glynn and his partner called Joe's chauffeur and told him that they had information that he had been upstate trying to retrieve property that had belonged to Diane. And he said yes, that was true. He said that no one had showed up. So the chauffeur agreed to come to the police station. And when he was asked about Diane, he said that he believed she had left on her own. He was allowed to leave, but the police continued to follow him. The detective following him reported that he had picked up someone at the airport and drove that person to a hotel, and they would learn that this was the lawyer, Vinnie Federico. Detective Glynn went to Diane's desk at Harper's to look through her papers, and among other things, he found Joe's financial statement. And Glynn saw that Joe had hundreds of thousands of dollars hidden in Switzerland and Mexico. So this made him a big flight risk.
So and then Karina and a friend showed up at Joe's and offered to take the two kids out for dinner. The plan was to take the kids to the detectives for questioning. So Joe allowed Karina to take them. It did turn out that Blake was too young to interview, but Glynn interviewed Claudia. Claudia was very closed off and didn't tell Glynn anything.
Well, it's horrible, but I have to wonder, did Joe talk to her?
Yeah.
On Wednesday, October 28th at about 2:45, William Heller, a New York State Thruway Authority equipment operator, was riding in a slow-moving dump truck on the shoulder of the northbound lane of the Thruway. He was inspecting the drainage ditches for obstructions like fallen tree branches from the previous night's storm. Then something caught his eye. It had a canvas or plastic covering wrapped around what he guessed might be a human body, so he told his partner to stop the truck. Heller got out, walked down the slope of the culvert, and groped around for this item, and his hands touched a human foot. He took out a pocket knife and cut the covering. Then a pair of women's legs in black hose were revealed. And this was just about 5 minutes away from the car wash where Diane's things had been found. So this Joe is vicious, but not very smart about this.
He hadn't thought it all through.
Well, no. Plus, he was probably on drugs.
Yeah.
Now, Heller got back in the truck and radioed his dispatcher, and state police troopers were called, so they arrived on the scene. The body was believed to be Diane. An officer at the Amagansett house was asked to look at the towels at the house to see if they matched the ones found wrapped around the body, and they did. They were some unusual imported towels sold only in East Coast stores. The DA for New York, who was assigned to prosecute Diane's case, was Alan Joseph, and he believed that the towels were proof that only Joe could have wrapped up Diane's body. At the New York duplex, Blake and Claudia were being babysat by Joe's niece, but the police had no idea where Joe was. The police did an emergency removal of the children. They took them to the police station and contacted Child Protective Services. Detective Glynn asked for permission to keep Blake and Claudia at his house overnight, but Child Protection refused, so the children ended up sleeping in chairs at the DHS office. The medical examiner who performed Diane's autopsy found that her cause of death was strangulation. She had bruises on her neck and a broken hyoid bone. It's believed that hands were used, followed by a cord around her neck. And of course she also had some serious blunt force trauma to her head, which that would have killed her if she hadn't been strangled anyway.
So by Thursday, investigators were still trying to find Joe. Checks of hotels, airports, and family members were all dead ends. They contacted his attorney, Federico, who eventually told them that Joe had fired him at lunchtime that very day, and he was meeting with 2 new attorneys in a suite at 305 Madison Avenue, right at that particular time. So the police rushed to the address and waited outside the elevators. And then when Joe exited the elevator, he was arrested for Diane's murder.
Well, 2 police officers checked on the phone calls that Joe had made, and they found that he had called his ex-wife Sandra several times. So they called Sandra and asked her some questions. They told her that Joe was a suspect in his wife's murder, and Sandra told them that she was lucky it wasn't her, and that she knew someday his temper would be his downfall. But Sandra explained that she had visited New York recently to get alimony money, but she didn't mention that Joe had asked her to be his children's guardian. She also lied to the police and told them that she hadn't spoken to Joe since her visit to New York. When confronted about the calls that Joe had made to her, she claimed that she had missed the calls. She said that Joe had left messages on her answering machine, but guess what? She'd erased the messages.
Yeah, I know nothing.
Convenient. Now it's interesting because they found out Sandra was actually in a relationship with the lawyer, Vinny Federico, but she denied knowing that Joe had ever hired him. She was asked to call back if she remembered anything else that was important to the investigation. After his arrest, Joe cried and said that Diane had been a bad mother. He said he loved his children. Then he said, "That's why I did it. She was such a bitch. She deserved it." He said that he had never done anything wrong in his life before. And he asked how much bail was going to cost him.
What a guy.
Yeah.
Now at the station, Joe said that Diane was an evil, malicious person who had mentally tried to break him down to where he couldn't take it anymore. He said he didn't care how long he had to go to prison because everyone was better off without Diane. And as he was processed, Joe complained about his 2 new attorneys. He had just paid them $50,000 and they weren't even there with him. He said he would just stop payment on the check he'd given them. Now he was told to undress, and the police saw that he was wearing women's underwear. They also found a large scratch from his stomach around to his back, and Joe said he had gotten the scratch from playing with the kids.
And that same night, Joe asked to see Diane's body. They took him to see her, and he remarked that she'd be very upset if she knew they were looking at her without makeup.
Oh, Jesus.
So he was kind of casual and gross about the whole thing.
Great comment.
At his arraignment, Joe's bail was set for $350,000. A corporate securities lawyer named Paul Kurland read about Diane's murder in the paper, and he had met Joe once. So the next Sunday, November 1st, Kurland and his friend, who was a criminal lawyer, Ronald Beckoff, visited Joe in jail. Neither was officially hired by Joe. His attorneys were preparing his bail motion, but Kurland and Beckoff agreed to act as advisors in Joe's civil and criminal cases. Before they left, Joe asked Kurland to help him make sure his children were all right. So this was the start of the legal battle during which Diane's worst fear would become true. After Diane's funeral, her father Don and other members of her family met to talk about what was best for her children, Claudia and Blake. Diane had mentioned 2 of Joe's nephews in her will as possible guardians, and a cousin of Diane's agreed to take the children if the nephews couldn't. Diane's father contacted Diane's divorce attorney to check if there was a retainer left from her, and the attorney checked and said yes, there was $10,000 left. So the children were sent to Washington to stay with one of Joe's nephews. Then on November 9th, Joe got out on bail by paying $180,000 of his own money, and he actually got friends to pay the other $170,000. Who would do that?
Well, obviously none of Diane's co-workers.
No, I think it was investment people.
Yeah.
When he got out, the first thing he wanted to do was see his children.
Yes, and the mother of one of Claudia's classmates heard that Joe might get custody of the kids. When she raised her concerns about this with the school's headmaster, the headmaster told her that Joe had already spoken with him, and he was cheerful and rational, and the whole thing was a dreadful mistake which would be cleared up.
So I guess he was able to charm and fool people.
I guess so. The mother then went to a friend who was the editor of New York Magazine, and they contacted the Manhattan DA. The DA assistant, Mary O'Donoghue, worked for the Child Abuse Unit, and she took care of the case.
Yeah, the attorney Kurland had advised Joe not to meet with the children at their home, so he arranged to meet them at a hotel. O'Donoghue heard about this and called the child abuse hotline to report that 2 children who may have witnessed their father murdering their mother were now with their father. That night, the children were moved to Joe's apartment. A caseworker reported to O'Donoghue that the children were with their father and that they were safe. There was nothing they could do because there was no evidence of abuse or neglect, so the children were considered not to be in immediate danger. O'Donoghue, the caseworker, and 3 state troopers went to Joe's apartment to take the children into protective custody. The next day, there was a hearing in family court to decide if Joe could have the children for the weekend. The judge ruled that he could. During the week, the children would stay with Joe's nephew in Washington. But that December, the nephew said that he couldn't take care of the 2 children anymore, and he sent them back to live with Joe full time.
So nobody's monitoring this?
Well, they are, but they don't think that there's a problem with it, the ones that are supposed to do something.
Okay. So Diane's cousin and her husband filed for custody of Claudia and Blake. They expressed concern for the children. The filing mentioned that Diane's murder should be considered an extraordinary circumstance.
You would think so.
You sure would. The first custody hearing was held on December 17th. The judge in this hearing decided that Claudia should testify. She said that whether the children had witnessed something or not, Claudia could give testimony so that the information would be out and they would, therefore, be out of any danger.
That's a lot of things to assume incorrectly.
What kind of reasoning?
Yeah, this judge is such an asshole.
The judge questioned Claudia alone in her chambers. Then she came out and said that the children adore their father and miss him. The judge analyzed the child caseworker files and concluded there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. So she allowed Claudia and Blake to stay with Joe that weekend, adding that in some ways, Diane's voice from beyond and her willingness to leave the children in that household for well over a year after hiring a divorce attorney indicated that the children were not in any greater danger from Joe than any child is from any parent in New York.
What kind of rationale is that? That's not logical.
Well, it's just, yeah, they seem okay to me, so I'm going to let them go.
Well, they're kind of blaming Diane, though, because they're saying she kept them in that household for over a year after she hired a divorce attorney.
Yeah.
So what makes them in any more danger now that he's murdered her, basically? On Monday, December 21st, the hearing was continued, and Diane's former divorce attorney brought into the court the 5-page memo that Diane had given him, which said that the children were not safe with Joe. So in part, Diane had written, "This is a situation in which their babysitters are subjected to extreme anger or dismissal, their mother is belittled and denigrated, they have no ability to predict their schedule or whereabouts, no constancy in human relationships, just a constant round of limousine pickups, late hours, junk food, and presents. Their father exhibits extreme and unpredictable behavior. He is frequently sadistic, abusive, violent, paranoid, antisocial, controlling, and sexually perverse. I want this unwholesome, disruptive presence removed from our lives so my children can grow up without emotional scarring." But since she wasn't there to give evidence, Diane's words weren't even admitted. Neither was a statement from her AA sponsor who described Joe as dangerous. But Joe was allowed to take the stand, and he denied everything. He said that Diane had verbally abused the children, so the hearing was adjourned until after the new year. But the judge ruled that the children could stay with their father until January 6th, when the hearing would continue. So that's just outrageous.
It is. Diane's friends protested against this decision, picketing at the state Supreme Court. And a lot of people didn't participate out of fear that Joe would retaliate. So it's difficult to get witnesses for the custody hearing, too, because people were afraid of Joe. Then, on Monday, January 4th, Joe was indicted for second-degree murder. When the custody hearing recommenced, a psychiatrist who had evaluated Joe testified that all he saw was love and devotion between the children and their father, and that it was a healthy relationship. But he did say there was a possibility that something could happen to the children.
And why would you ever take that risk?
This is an expert. Jeez.
So the judge asked the psychiatrist if there could be harm from removing the children from their father's custody and whether that would outweigh the possibility of harm coming to them in his care. And the psychiatrist said yes, because the children believe that their father's innocent. He said Joe is their daddy and they love him. So again, the judge granted Joe temporary custody. The children's attorney was just disgusted with all this and at the end of his rope, and he went to the media. And the New York Post ran an article with the headline, "Lawyer says judge in wife kill case is playing Russian roulette with kids' lives." So the custody hearing continued, and one child psychiatrist rebutted the earlier testimony. She said that children love in the face of many abuses. Children have begged to be returned to psychotic mothers, and many have no trouble loving a father who beats them. Another psychiatrist said that since Joe would likely be going to prison for a long time, he should actually be allowed to spend as much time as possible with his children. So we've got those two differing opinions. In April, the judge decided that Joe should have custody of his children. She had heavily relied on the testimony of Mary Bain, so this is an interesting person. Mary Bain was the mother of one of Claudia's classmates. Mary and her husband Stephen had invited Joe and Claudia over for a playdate, and after that playdate, Mary had said that Joe was not the bad man the newspapers had portrayed him as. She said that he was actually kind, funny, charming, and charismatic. And after that playdate, Claudia had begun calling Mary every day and asking to speak to the daughter, Jennifer. And Mary had gotten to know Joe better. In February, Mary's husband Stephen said that Mary was hardly ever home anymore. Mary offered to adopt Claudia and Blake if Joe went to prison. Then, by early April, Mary had left Stephen. They were separated.
Jesus.
Yeah, and Mary was now in a romantic relationship with Joe.
Well, you said he could be very charming.
I guess so, but what's wrong with these women? I have to wonder about that, too. I don't want to victim blame at all, but some of these women are making strange choices.
So Joe began talking about marrying Mary. Holy cow. His attorney advised against it. But Joe went ahead and married Mary in July. And Claudia and Blake began to call Mary Mommy. In August, Mary filed for custody of the children. And when Diane's cousin heard about that, she again tried to get custody. Joe requested a hearing to block them. The hearing was in September. It came out then that Mary had been going to counseling because she was having marital problems with Joe. And they'd only been married for 2 months.
I didn't think it would take long.
In one of her sessions, Mary described an incident when she got home late one day, and Joe cut her dress with a hunting knife. Mary ran from the house and Joe chased her. And more importantly, Claudia and Blake had witnessed the incident.
Isn't that horrible?
Jesus.
So Joe did withdraw his custody petition after that came out, and the children were immediately placed with Diane's cousin and her husband. A request was made to hold Joe until after the cousin got the children, but that was denied. So when they left the courthouse, Joe and Mary got in their car and rushed to get the children before the cousin could. But the police did get to the children first and placed them in protective custody.
Phew.
Yeah, but it's not over because after the children were living with Diane's cousin, Joe was still allowed to call his children every evening. And on just the second call, Joe told his son Blake that he was going to come through the window and take him away. There was an armed security guard placed at the house where the children were living. The next day, Joe crashed his car into his own house. So the next time Claudia and Blake talked to Joe, he asked them for street names and the address of the house where they were staying. Fortunately, the cousin's husband was listening in on this call. So Joe's nightly calls were suspended and he was banned from the area where the children were living. But the children's counselor then recommended that the children have visits with their father, so he was granted visits every Sunday. A security guard was always there with Joe, and he was always searched before the visits. But still. And then Joe pleaded not guilty to Diane's murder, so his trial began January 31st, 1989. Joe's ex-wife Sandra testified. Her attorney had contacted the police earlier and told them that she had more information she hadn't shared with them. So she was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony. Sandra testified that Joe had confessed to her and wanted to bury Diane's body in her yard. She also said she only went along with him to get Joe out of her house.
Joe's defense was self-defense. He claimed that Diane had been cheating on him, and on the night she was killed, he had confronted her. He said that Diane had charged at him with a knife, and that had caused the long scratch on his side. During this attack, Joe said he had to kill Diane to protect himself. Jury didn't buy it. They found him guilty.
So Joe's sentencing hearing was on April 18th, but Mary Bain had found new evidence. A tape where Joe and Diane had a fight, and Diane threatened to stab Joe. And Joe's lawyer asked for a postponement of the sentencing until the evidence could be presented in a petition to set aside the guilty verdict and ask for a new trial. And the judge agreed to this. But that June, Joe was transferred from the jail to the hospital. His health was deteriorating quickly, and he died just hours later. So 6 months later, his conviction was vacated because he died before he had a chance to appeal. In 1990, Claudia and Blake were adopted by Diane's cousin and her husband. So it's not known if the children had woken up and witnessed their mother's murder or not. Technically, Joe died an innocent man, and he was buried in the cemetery near the house where he killed Diane. So what a crazy story.
Totally. Holy cow. Truth is stranger than fiction.
It certainly is, but I'm really glad that the children finally got to go with someone from Diane's family. But wow, what those kids went through. I hope they turned out okay, because it's just a lot of trauma.
We don't have anything.
No, hopefully they're anonymous.
It's 30 years ago now.
Yeah, it's been a long time. But what a case.
It's time for listener feedback.
So let's do a little feedback. What have we got?
I got a voicemail and a couple emails today. And the voicemail is from Linda L. Has a case suggestion.
Hi, Dick and Jill. This is Linda from South Texas. I wanted to recommend the case against Elizabeth Wettlaufer, Wettlaufer, from Canada, who was an RN at a skilled nursing facility. She killed 8 elderly people with insulin overdoses because she thought God was telling her that she needed to do it. When she was assigned to monitoring glucose levels of children in a new job, she self-admitted to a psychiatric hospital. The psychiatrist there convinced her to make a list of her victims, including those who didn't die. Making the list ultimately led her to turn herself into the police. The video of the confession is fascinating, and it's available on the internet and well worth a watch. I think this case is right up your alley. Also, I'd like to comment on another listener's recommendation of the case of Darrell Brooks, who ran over the Christmas parade. He did that in response to a rage against the mother of one of his children, Erica, whom he had run over approximately a week prior with the same SUV that he drove over the parade. He was furious with her because she wouldn't give him $300 to keep him out on bail from the case of assault on her with that same vehicle. The trial is available for watching on the internet, and because he represented himself, it is quite the 3-ring circus. Highlighted scenes are of him removing articles of clothing, being put in a separate courtroom where he could be seen and not heard, and he could see and hear courtroom. And this was because of his outrageous outbursts. Kudos to Judge Jennifer Doro, who demonstrated an incredible amount of patience and firmness all at the same time. Evidence at the trial showed he had a prior conviction for an inappropriate relationship with a minor who just happened to be Erica, who he had the rage attack against just prior to running over the Christmas parade. Also, at the sentencing hearing, both his mother and grandmother, who seemed to be lovely, upstanding, and successful people, appeared and asked the judge for a pass on sentencing due to his mental illness. Judge Doro gave him 6 consecutive life sentences, plus I don't know how many 100 years. Anyway, please keep making more podcasts. I will continue to listen as long as you keep putting them out. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Linda. That's awfully nice of you to say. So this Daryl Brooks, we did get several emails telling us about that because we didn't know what was going on with him prior to that. So that's quite a story.
But it's a very fascinating story.
It is. Some major mental illness there.
You think?
And what about the other case of the nurse? Have you heard of that one before?
I hadn't. She confessed to killing 8 people and attempting to kill another 6. So 14 people total that she confessed to overdosing with insulin. And this occurred over a period of 9 years from 2007 to 2016. She was sentenced to life in prison, but is eligible for parole, according to what I was reading, in 2041.
So what's with these healthcare people? Like, we watched that movie, The Good Nurse, read the book. We've covered many nurses who have killed babies and things like that. Is there some kind of mental illness with that? Because that's just not like a regular murder. There's some kind of, I would think, like a compulsion involved.
Well, you're doing it because you're thinking that you're saving them from a worse death. So it's better to kill them early.
Not all of them are thinking that, though. There have been fairly healthy people killed by nurses and doctors.
And others can do it just because they can.
Well, what about that Dr. Dunch? I'll never understand that.
Oh,
I need a psychiatric review of that one.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks again, Linda. That's great. And we have an email from Judith. You want to read that one, Dickie?
Judith says, absolutely love your podcast as I am a true crime junkie. Since accidentally discovering you during the initial phases of COVID, I've listened to every one of your podcasts and some more than once.
All right, you go, girl.
In spite of the tragic and horrific circumstances of the subject matter, your soothing voices and matter-of-fact delivery calms my restless mind and successfully combats my decades-long struggle with insomnia. So I humbly thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Just hearing stuff like that warms my heart, really
I'm going
does.
to market myself as a sleep inducer.
Yeah, you could.
So, in 1966, when I was 20, the name Richard Speck became a household name. That's right. So, I was about that same age. Let's see, in 66, I was 18.
Okay.
So, yes, Richard Speck is definitely a household name. He killed 8 nursing students in Chicago in 1966. He had corralled them into one room and took them out of the room one by one.
He killed all of these nursing students at once? In one event?
At one event.
Holy shit.
And actually there was a 9th one. He apparently knew there were 8 women nursing students there. There was a 9th, and she escaped by hiding under a bed.
Wow.
So he killed 8. He was sentenced to the death penalty. And then the death penalty was revoked or taken off the table, and he was later resentenced to life in prison. He had an apparent heart attack in 1991 and died, so he was in prison for about 25 years.
Well, you know, that name, Richard Speck, sounds familiar to me, but the case, I have no knowledge of it at all, so I'll look into it. I bet there's a book about it, at least one.
Oh, yeah, there is.
Yeah. Well, what was that we watched on a murderer back in the old days, 50s or 60s? The Boston Strangler.
Boston Strangler.
That was interesting.
You got some new info.
A lot of new info, yes. Okay, so let me do one more email.
Okay, this is it, last one.
Yeah, this is a case suggestion from Kathy. She says she's been binge watching all of our podcasts on our YouTube channel, and she loves them. She says, the way you two are together, bouncing off one another, would like to know if you have ever done the Mary Lynn Witherspoon case. She was stalked and murdered by her ex-boyfriend's son, Edmonds Brown. Lots of people have done podcasts on her. I bet you can do the case better. Ah, a challenge.
The challenge.
Best I found was an actress on Below, Obsession Dark Desires, Season 3, Episode 10. There's something about Mary Lynn. Nice title.
Yeah.
All right, yeah. Well, we will take your challenge and look that up.
We'll check it. I was looking it up, and it was interesting because she was a teacher in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where we've been a lot these last few weeks with the Murdoch case.
Yes.
In that area of the state. She was killed by her ex-boyfriend's son. Apparently, from the little bit I read, he stalked her for 20-some years.
And then killed her. Wow. Well, thank you, Kathy. That's a great suggestion.
So definitely look into that.
Yep, I'm going to look them all up as soon as I can.
All right.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time at The Quiet End.
Save a seat for you. Come on down.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, guys.